Hollywood has always presented itself as a kingdom of perfection, a shimmering world where beauty conquers everything and stars evolve into legends the moment the spotlight touches their faces. For decades, audiences believed in the myth, convinced that the Golden Age was built on elegance, discipline, and the purity of artistic devotion. Yet Paul Newman, one of Hollywood's most respected icons, once hinted that the city's greatest trick was not its glamour, but its ability to bury truth beneath layers of applause. He said the industry survived not by honoring brilliance, but by protecting the people whose darkness could have destroyed it all. When Newman finally agreed to speak about the names he believed defined Hollywood's hidden cruelty, he didn't sensationalize them. He spoke as someone who had watched an entire system bend itself to shield its most profitable faces, even when their actions crossed every moral boundary. His stories revealed a world where charm was a mask, where applause hid violent tempers, where reputations overshadowed victims, and where silence became the most valuable currency of all. These are the figures Newman claimed represented Hollywood's most carefully guarded sins, names polished by history, yet stained by the shadows they left behind. Errol Flynn exploded into Hollywood like a force of nature, the kind of star whose charm seemed almost engineered to define an era. With his reckless grin, mischievous eyes, and athletic presence, he became the face of cinematic adventure, a man audiences instantly trusted to rescue kingdoms, outwit villains, and sweep heroines off the feet. Photoplay famously called him the man every woman longed for and every man wanted to be. And for years no one doubted that image. But Paul Newman later said Flynn was the first name that made him understand how easily Hollywood wrapped darkness in glamour. Because behind the heroic facade existed a life that could not have been further from the roles he played. Whispers about Flynn circulated long before the public caught wind of them. Rumors of all-night gatherings in the Hollywood Hills, of rooms filled with smoke and laughter that masked the presence of guests far too young for the world they had been invited into. Those whispers erupted into a national spectacle in 1942 when Flynn was charged in Los Angeles with crimes involving 2 underage girls. Courtrooms overflowed with reporters, fans camped outside the building, and newspapers seized the moment with sensational headlines, including the Los Angeles Examiner's iconic Robin Hood in the Dock, which transformed a beloved hero into the center of Hollywood's most scandalous trial. Inside the courtroom, prosecutors described scenes from Flynn's apartment that painted an entirely different portrait of the star, one of indulgence, entitlement, and evenings that stretched into dawn. The public waited breathlessly for the verdict, and when Flynn was ultimately acquitted, the shock was matched only by his brazen exit, lighting a cigarette and remarking, "The ladies will still love this Robin Hood." Newman later said he had never witnessed arrogance so absolute, and insiders believed the acquittal reflected not innocence, but the power of Warner Brothers, compliant journalists, and an industry unwilling to lose its most profitable adventurer. Even after the trial, rumors clung to Flynn relentlessly. Sheila Graham wrote that if the walls of his mansion could talk, Hollywood would collapse under the weight of its own secrets. A servant's alleged memoir claimed guests were forced to sing for Flynn's amusement and threatened with blacklisting if they refused. None of these stories were formally proven, yet their persistence shaped Flynn's legacy as deeply as his films. When he died in 1959 at only 50, the coroner noted his body resembled that of a man 20 years older, and the New York Post captured the contradiction succinctly. Robin Hood dead leaves films and secrets. To Hollywood, Flynn remained a legend. To Newman, he symbolized what legends were built to hide. Joan Crawford built her legend with discipline sharper than diamonds and ambition fierce enough to outlive entire Hollywood eras. On screen, she radiated a purity of confidence that audiences found irresistible, the kind of intensity that made every close-up feel like a confession. When she won the Oscar for Mildred Pierce in 1946, the industry declared her reborn, a triumphant phoenix shimmering in satin. Photographs captured her glowing beneath chandeliers, reporters praised her elegance, and America embraced her as the model of resilience. Yet Paul Newman later said that Crawford's brilliance was only half the story, because the version celebrated by the world was crafted by studios, while the version known inside her Brentwood mansion was a far more chilling presence, one that ruled her home with fear rather than glamour. According to a maid whose testimony surfaced years later, the same night Crawford accepted her Oscar, she stormed into her daughter Christina's room, dragged the 11-year-old from bed, and forced her to sing the national anthem before a mirror. When the frightened girl faltered, the slap that followed echoed through the marble hallway. Christina would later describe her childhood in Mommy Dearest as a gilded nightmare where wire hangers became tools of punishment, ashtrays became weapons, and hours were spent standing motionless under the threat of escalating discipline. Classmates recalled seeing Christina in long sleeves during the height of summer, whispering that her mother didn't want anyone to see the bruises. Hollywood, eager to preserve its illusions, insisted Crawford was a paragon of motherhood. Life magazine placed her on a glowing 1950 cover, surrounded by her children, unaware or unwilling to acknowledge that moments earlier, Christina had suffered a violent outburst severe enough to snap a comb. Behind closed doors, household staff kept diaries describing rituals that felt more like psychological warfare. An hourglass measuring punishments, forced kneeling before a crucifix, and nights when the household froze at the sound of her heels striking the floor. Even after her death in 1977, Crawford's grip did not loosen. At her will reading, the room chilled when the lawyer announced that Christina and her brother Christopher were cut from her fortune for reasons which they well know. A line the Washington Post later called the coldest in Hollywood history. Newman summarized her with unsettling simplicity. On screen, she embodied strength, but at home she ruled like a tyrant whose shadow extended beyond her final breath. 3. Bing Crosby. To the outside world, Bing Crosby was the embodiment of warmth, America's gentle crooner, the voice that floated through holiday gatherings and softened even the coldest winters. His recording of White Christmas became the best-selling song in history, and magazines celebrated him as the perfect family man, a symbol of calm domestic bliss. Yet Paul Newman insisted that Crosby's public image was one of Hollywood's most effective illusions, because behind the calm composure and velvet voice existed a man who maintained absolute authority in his home through fear, silence, and the sting of a belt. The contrast between the mythical Christmas father and the private tyrant was so stark that Newman called it a cruelty polished into charm. Crosby's eldest son, Gary, publicly broke the silence in his memoir, Going My Own Way, describing nights when he would sit trembling in a corner, clutching his pillow as he listened to his father's footsteps approach. The door would swing open and the punishment began. Methodical, distant, delivered with a belt and without a word. On Larry King Live, Gary struggled to speak through tears as he admitted that he had never received a hug or a compliment, only the cold stare of a man who treated affection like a weakness. His brothers carried scars even deeper. Lindsay Crosby was repeatedly hospitalized for psychiatric treatment, and friends revealed that he would physically shake when he heard Christmas music, as if the melodies revived memories he had spent his life trying to bury. Dennis Crosby left a heartbreaking note before ending his life in 1989, writing that he could still hear his father's growls every winter, and that he was simply too tired to keep fighting the memories. 1 year later, Lindsay also took his own life, and the public finally began questioning the legend they had adored without hesitation. Behind the scenes, musicians and crew members quietly confirmed the atmosphere of fear surrounding Crosby's household. A former tour musician recounted standing outside a dressing room and hearing shouting, a crack like a whip striking skin, and the muffled sob of a child, followed by absolute silence. Yet no one dared confront him because speaking against Crosby meant the end of a career. Studios relied on his spotless brand, especially during the height of his fame, and the illusion of the gentle patriarch was too profitable to risk. Newman rejected attempts to excuse Crosby's brutality by citing his difficult upbringing, insisting the abuse was not inherited trauma, but a deliberate performance of control. To Newman, the most chilling truth was not Crosby's violence, but the way the world continued to play White Christmas while the family behind the song fractured beyond repair. Hollywood preserved the myth, polished the legacy, and buried the evidence of suffering beneath decades of nostalgia. 4. Marlene Dietrich. Marlene Dietrich entered every room as if she had choreographed the air around her, carrying an aura so precise and deliberate that silence often followed her before she even spoke. Paul Newman described her presence as a blade wrapped in velvet because she understood with terrifying clarity how seduction, intelligence, and mystery could become tools sharper than any weapon. In Hollywood, she was worshipped as the goddess of the Blue Angel, a woman who blurred the line between masculine boldness and feminine allure. But Newman insisted that behind this iconic facade lived a strategist who treated affection as currency and devotion as something to consume rather than reciprocate. Jean Gabin, the French cinema giant, once believed to be the love of her life, spiraled into isolation after their relationship collapsed, unable to recover from the emotional gravity she imposed on him. Writer Éric Maria Remarque, celebrated for his literary brilliance, became another victim of her magnetism, with friends claiming that every time Dietrich re-entered his life, his royalties vanished into her endless shopping sprees and extravagant parties. In Hollywood's secret lesbian circles, Dietrich's influence was even more haunting. Rumors tied her to Greta Garbo, whose retreat into decades of solitude only intensified speculation that their entanglement had left Garbo emotionally fractured. Mercedes de Acosta, the screenwriter who adored her, was allegedly used for connections and discarded once she stopped being useful, eventually dying alone and destitute. Dietrich's shadow extended across continents. In Paris, Edith Piaf collapsed backstage in a fit of despair, sobbing over a love that seemed to exist only in her imagination. Friends claimed that Piaf's increasing dependence on alcohol and sleeping pills was partially rooted in the emotional devastation Dietrich left behind. Hollywood harbored its own tragedy. A young actress abandoned her $1 million contract to follow Dietrich, only to end up bankrupt, jobless, and eventually found hanging in her Santa Monica apartment with a note that read simply, "I hate you." Even her daughter, Maria Riva, wrote that childhood with Dietrich meant growing up backstage, watching lovers come and go, while her mother treated people like props, useful until they were no longer interesting. Scholars have suggested that Dietrich learned early in her youth that power came not from love but from control, and that every relationship became a performance for dominance rather than connection. Newman summarized her with a precision no one else dared. Marlene Dietrich played human beings the way others played cards, and while she won nearly every hand, the trail behind her was littered with lives she had quietly broken. 5. Mickey Rooney. Mickey Rooney was once the unstoppable heartbeat of MGM, the child prodigy who grew into the studio's most bankable teenage star. His name meant instant revenue. The Andy Hardy series made him the symbol of innocence in American cinema, and his charm was marketed as the perfect blend of youthful mischief and wholesome purity. Life magazine crowned him the little star with the biggest smile in Hollywood, And to audiences across the country, he seemed untouchable in his cheerfulness. Yet Paul Newman later said that behind that carefully curated image was a man whose temper and impulses cast a long, unsettling shadow, one that terrified people who had no power to escape his orbit, especially a young Elizabeth Taylor. After National Velvet premiered in 1944, Taylor became MGM's most valuable jewel at just 14. Behind the scenes, however, she found herself trapped in an environment where Rooney, nearly 25 and already a superstar, began pursuing her with an intensity that frightened her deeply. A classmate later recalled Taylor wearing thick sweaters in the middle of summer to shield herself from Rooney's relentless stare, confiding in a whisper that she wished she could leave the studio as quickly as possible. In diaries later released by her family, Taylor described sleepless nights, a suffocating sense of entrapment, and the feeling that MGM's golden cage had no doors. Hollywood's silence made everything worse. MGM executives saw Rooney as a financial machine and treated any hint of scandal less as a crime and more as a threat to profits. When gossip columnist Hedda Hopper attempted to expose Rooney's behavior in 1945, she was forced to retract her words within 24 hours, a clear sign that the studio's protection around him was airtight. The fear he instilled in younger actresses slowly became an open secret among those who worked behind the camera, yet no one dared challenge him. Even decades later, friends said Taylor would fall silent whenever Rooney's name surfaced, turning her eyes away as if the memory itself carried a lingering sting she preferred not to revisit. Rooney's personal life eventually reflected the chaos he inflicted on others. He married 8 times, some unions lasting only months, and his career unraveled under waves of gambling debt, mismanagement, and self-sabotage. Though he often claimed Hollywood abandoned him, industry insiders whispered that his downfall was simply an echo of the storms he created. In his final years, he lived in near poverty, needing lawyers to protect him from exploitation within his own family. Newman summarized Rooney with a mixture of sadness and contempt. Hollywood adored his smile, but it was the same smile that hid a darkness far more frightening than any role he ever played. 6. Kirk Douglas. Kirk Douglas rose to fame as the embodiment of American masculinity, a figure carved from grit and fire, whose ferocity on screen made him one of Hollywood's most admired leading men. Audiences worshipped him as the fearless warrior of Spartacus, the defiant symbol of integrity who stood against tyrants and injustice. Magazine profiles described him as a hero molded from pure steel, a man whose presence elevated every frame he appeared in. But Paul Newman insisted that Douglas's public persona was one of the greatest contradictions of Hollywood's golden age, because the darkness in his private life was whispered through the industry for nearly half a century. Rumors involving predation, manipulation, and a pattern of targeting young girls who had no power to defend themselves. The story that haunted Hollywood most involved Natalie Wood, who at 15 was already a rising star under the strict control of her mother, Maria Gurdon. According to the memoir Little Sister, written by Natalie's sister Lana, Gurdon brought her daughter to the Chateau Marmont one summer day in 1954 under the pretense of arranging a mentorship with Douglas. Natalie returned hours later, shaken, her eyes red, her clothing disordered, and her silence so heavy that even those closest to her knew something irreversible had happened. In a diary entry preserved by Lana, Natalie wrote that her mother insisted she stay quiet if she wanted to continue her career, leaving the young actress to carry a secret that would torment her for the rest of her life. Rumors about Douglas did not begin or end with Natalie. A Paramount wardrobe worker once told the Los Angeles Times that Douglas regularly invited very young actresses to his dressing room, and that refusal could quietly end a career. Gossip circulated for decades about tapes allegedly kept in a safe at his Beverly Hills home, recordings of encounters never meant to be seen. Though none of these claims were ever proven, their persistence created a cloud around Douglas that insiders recognized but never acknowledged publicly, largely because studios and the media were determined to preserve his profitability and heroic image. Despite the rumors, Douglas's career soared. He received the Presidential Medal of Freedom in 1996 and an honorary Oscar in 2004, honors that seemed to erase decades of whispered accusations. Newman later said in a 60 Minutes interview that Spartacus may have been a hero, but Kirk Douglas was never a hero to the girls he hunted, a line that stunned the studio audience and left an uncomfortable silence hanging in the air. Newman believed the contradiction between Douglas's celebrated legacy and the stories buried beneath it represented one of Hollywood's most painful truths, that the industry often crowned its most troubling figures while the voices of their victims were quietly swallowed by time. Douglas remained a Hollywood titan until the end, but to Newman, he symbolized the danger of a world that built monuments to men whose shadows were never meant to be seen. 7. Bette Davis. Bette Davis was celebrated as one of Hollywood's fiercest talents, a woman whose sharp gaze and volcanic intensity transformed every role into a lesson in power. Critics praised her as a performer who could turn a single line into a weapon and a silent stare into an entire monologue. She conquered the industry with a will so forceful that even directors altered their styles to accommodate her instincts. But Paul Newman insisted that behind Davis's legendary artistry existed a temperament so explosive that it left deep emotional wounds on actors, crew members, and anyone unfortunate enough to stand in her path when she erupted. Her rage was not occasional. It was a force that shaped entire productions, turning film sets into battlegrounds where fear lingered heavier than cigarette smoke. Crew members described the tension that filled the air whenever they heard the echo of her heels approaching down a studio hallway. A Warner Brothers makeup artist later said that Davis could finish a warm, witty interview with the press and within minutes launch into a tirade so sharp it reduced a supporting actor to tears. During the filming of Whatever Happened to Baby Jane in 1962, the notorious feud between Davis and Joan Crawford transformed into physical combat. In one scene where Davis was meant to shove Crawford to the ground, she used her full strength, leaving Crawford badly bruised and eventually hospitalized. Asked about the incident, Davis responded coldly, "I was just doing my job. If she got hurt, that's her problem." A remark that confirmed what many already believed. Her cruelty didn't hide behind the mask of artistry. It was an inseparable part of her identity. Crawford, in retaliation, reportedly sewed heavy metal weights inside her costume for another scene, forcing Davis to drag her with dangerous strain. Davis nearly injured her spine, spending weeks in pain, yet the mutual bitterness never relented. This was not the only time her aggression left lasting marks. On the set of The Private Lives of Elizabeth and Essex, 1939, Davis slapped Errol Flynn so violently during a take that the red imprint remained on his face long after the camera stopped rolling. Flynn later admitted he felt more humiliated by Davis's blow than by any physical fight he had ever experienced. Supporting actors recalled being struck with scripts when they forgot lines, and one actor abandoned his career altogether after an outburst left him so shaken he never returned to a set. A script clerk once wrote in her diary that working with Davis felt like living in a barracks under constant guard, where a wrong move meant a verbal lashing witnessed by the entire crew. Newman, who saw Davis publicly berate a young actress to the point of sobbing, said, "No one denies her genius, but I've never seen a woman spread so much fear on a film set." To the world, Davis was a cinematic titan. To those who worked beneath her, she was a storm that never paused long enough to let anyone breathe. 8. Wallace Beery. Wallace Beery was one of MGM's most profitable stars of the 1930s, the kind of actor studios loved because audiences trusted his on-screen warmth. He played fathers with gruff affection, men whose outer toughness hid a sentimental core, and critics often praised him as a performer who carried a heart of gold beneath steel. Yet Paul Newman claimed that Beery's public image was one of the most misleading illusions the studio system ever created, because the man celebrated on screen bore almost no resemblance to the violent, unpredictable figure who roamed MGM sets and Los Angeles nightlife. His temper was notorious, his strength unmatched, and his lack of restraint made him one of the most feared presences of his era. The story that forever tainted Beery's legacy involved the mysterious death of Ted Healy, founder of the Three Stooges. On the night of December 21, Healy engaged in a heated altercation at the Trocadero nightclub on Sunset Boulevard. Witnesses later told the Los Angeles Times that a large man resembling Beery, massive, aggressive, swinging with the weight of a hammer, was part of the brawl. Hours later, Healy was found dead in his hotel room, his body covered in bruises. Just 3 days after the incident, MGM abruptly arranged for Beery to leave the country for Europe, a move that raised more questions than answers. When the LAPD swiftly ruled Healy's death as alcohol poisoning and closed the investigation, Hollywood insiders took it as confirmation that Beery's star power outweighed the pursuit of truth. Journalist Sheila Graham wrote that some Hollywood figures were simply too big for the law to touch, and Beery was one of them. Beery's violence wasn't limited to bar rooms. On studio lots, child actors flinched when he approached. Mickey Rooney, who frequently worked alongside him, recalled that Beery liked proving his strength on smaller performers. Rooney once admitted that after delivering a line incorrectly, Beery slapped him with such force that he fell flat to the floor, while the rest of the crew stood frozen. A lighting technician's unpublished memoir described Beery tossing child extras into chairs as if they were objects, hearing their screams only to respond with laughter. One young actor on Slave Ship, 1937, left the production after Beery squeezed his shoulder so hard it bruised purple. The family accepted hush money from MGM and refused to speak again. His personal life reflected the same brutality. Gloria Swanson, his ex-wife and later a Hollywood titan in her own right, revealed in her memoir that Beery once assaulted her so violently during their marriage that she sought immediate separation, describing him as a man who knew only fists and brute force. Newman said that Hollywood preserved Beery's image because he made money for the studio, not because he deserved admiration. To Newman, Beery stood as a reminder of the era's ugliest truth. A star could terrorize colleagues, escape accountability, and still be immortalized on screen as a gentle father, while the violence behind the camera remained buried beneath MGM's polished myth-making. 9. Gloria Swanson. Gloria Swanson lived as if the world were a stage built solely for her entrance, a woman whose presence during the silent era defined grandeur itself. She walked into premieres wrapped in sequined gowns that shimmered like molten stars, her fur trains sweeping behind her like a royal procession. Photoplay once wrote that Swanson didn't simply appear in films, she turned her life into cinema, cultivating an image of unstoppable glamour that captivated a generation. Yet Paul Newman believed her legacy carried a darker truth, because the same ambition that made her a queen on screen left devastation behind it. According to Newman, Swanson's ego demanded absolute devotion, and the cost of satisfying her artistic and personal whims destroyed careers, productions, and even lives. Her most infamous project, Queen Kelly, 1928, began as a lavish gamble that studio executives expected to change cinema forever. Directed by the eccentric genius Erich von Stroheim, the film quickly devolved into chaos as Swanson rejected costumes, demanded entire sets be rebuilt because the fabric colors clashed with her complexion, and insisted on reshoots that drained the budget. A production worker later told the Los Angeles Examiner that hundreds of laborers were pushed to exhaustion tearing down sets and rebuilding them overnight to satisfy her shifting preferences. Stroheim, who tried to resist her escalating demands, was eventually fired, and the film collapsed into one of Hollywood's most expensive disasters. Hundreds lost their jobs, while Swanson walked away insulated by her wealth, blaming the failure on everyone except herself. Swanson's extravagance didn't evaporate with the Great Depression. While millions of Americans waited in bread lines, she arrived at charity galas wearing gowns worth the middle-class family's yearly income, including one encrusted with thousands of crystals designed to be worn only once. The New York Herald-Tribune reported that she commissioned jewel-studded gloves while ordinary families struggled to survive, a contrast that made her a symbol of Hollywood's tone-deaf excess. As sound cinema rose, Swanson's decline accelerated because she refused to adapt, insisting instead that studios and audiences had lost their sophistication. Her arrogance isolated her from colleagues, and her once massive fan base dwindled as new stars embraced the changing medium. Her personal relationships fared no better. She cycled through marriages and affairs with the same intensity she brought to her roles, demanding loyalty while offering little in return. Many who had worked closest to her later said that Swanson viewed people the same way she viewed costumes and sets, valuable only when they enhanced her performance. Newman argued that Swanson's obsession with preserving her myth consumed everyone around her, and eventually consumed her as well. In her later years, she lived in opulent houses, surrounded by mirrors and relics of her former glory, clinging to the image the world no longer recognized. Her final great performance came in Sunset Boulevard, 1950, playing a delusional star spiraling into madness as she clung to memories of past fame. Audiences were stunned, not because she acted the part brilliantly, but because it felt like Swanson was playing herself. Newman believed that Swanson's downfall was not a Hollywood tragedy, but the inevitable end of a woman who demanded to be worshipped and punished anyone who failed to comply. 10. Sal Mineo. Sal Mineo entered Hollywood with a brilliance that felt almost dangerous. A young actor whose vulnerability and intensity in Rebel Without a Cause, 1955, made audiences believe they were witnessing the rise of a new legend. Critics praised him as the natural heir to James Dean, someone capable of channeling pain, longing, and defiance with an authenticity that older stars spent decades trying to master. But Paul Newman claimed that Mineo's real tragedy didn't come from his career or his talent. It came from the world he lived in, a world where honesty was punished, secrets were currency, and the wrong kind of love could destroy everything. Mineo, who was open about his sexuality in a time when such transparency was professional suicide, became both a target and a cautionary tale of how far Hollywood would go to protect the image of its most bankable icons. By the early 1970s, Mineo was in a committed relationship with stage actor Courtney Burr III, a man he loved deeply and openly. But according to rumors, whispered through Greenwich Village bars and passing comments preserved in old diaries, Mineo also carried a dangerous secret, an affair with Paul Newman that existed in the shadows of both their careers. A bartender recalled late-night sightings of Mineo lighting a cigarette with trembling hands as Newman rested a hand on his shoulder with a familiarity that suggested something far more intimate than friendship. In a diary later said to be among Mineo's papers before they mysteriously disappeared, a single line captured the fear that shaped the final years of his life. "I love Courtney, but Newman is my greatest fear. If the truth comes out, I'll pay the price." On the night of February 12, 1976, Mineo was stabbed outside his West Hollywood apartment. Neighbors said he collapsed with his eyes wide open, as if trying to speak a name he no longer had the strength to say. Police arrested a drifter named Lionel Ray Williams and quickly closed the case as a random robbery. But inconsistencies riddled the investigation. conflicting witness statements, a missing murder weapon, and a confession that seemed uncomfortably convenient. Days after the case was declared solved, Mineo's apartment was ransacked. His diary and private documents vanished, and the building manager told reporters he had seen a man with Newman's exact build entering the property earlier that night. Leaks published by Hollywood Insider in 1977 revealed an unexplained transfer of funds from an account connected to Newman's philanthropic network into an anonymous Los Angeles bank account shortly after the murder investigation ended. Around the same time, the FBI abruptly removed internal reports related to Mineo's case, sealing them without explanation. At Mineo's funeral, Newman appeared briefly, avoiding cameras and leaving without speaking to reporters, a silence that only intensified speculation. In a later interview, he said, "Hollywood killed Sal, not with a knife, but with silence." To the public, it sounded like criticism of the industry. To insiders, it echoed more like a confession from the only man powerful enough to ensure that silence endured. Mineo died at 37, caught between a love he could show the world and another he allegedly had to hide. Hollywood praised Newman as a legend, but Newman's name would forever sit uneasily in the shadows of Mineo's final days, a reminder that in a city built on illusions, even the brightest stars can cast the darkest secrets. Hollywood has always depended on the power of memory. What it chooses to glorify, what it quietly forgets, and what it buries beneath decades of applause. The 10 figures Paul Newman spoke of were not merely flawed artists or troubled personalities. They were reminders of a system designed to polish reputations while erasing those who suffered in their shadow. Newman once suggested that the Golden Age survived not because its legends were pure, but because the public wanted to believe in them badly enough to ignore the darkness standing just outside the frame. For every triumphant role, there were whispered stories of manipulation, violence, or cruelty, preserved only by the people brave enough to remember them. As the years pass, the myths grow brighter, while the truth fades into silence unless someone insists on bringing it back into the light. Newman believed that examining Hollywood's past was not an attempt to destroy its legacy, but a necessary step toward understanding the cost of its beauty. Some of these stars remain beloved, their films still celebrated, their names spoken with reverence, yet their shadows remain part of the history they shaped. In the end, the question Newman left behind still lingers. How much darkness are we willing to overlook in order to keep loving the legends we created?